Recently, we had some massive news coming from Elliotte Friedman about how the 2024 NHL Draft almost went down completely differently. And specifically with the Montreal Canadiens, two separate trades that almost happened that we're going to be breaking down right here, right now. So make sure you watch till the end as we talk about all the trade rumors here today, and hit that subscribe button for you for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year. Now, we've heard a lot about the Habs and their 2024 NHL Draft recently, of course, with the major addition of Ivan Demidov finally getting signed to his entry-level contract. The Demidov era in Montreal has begun. And I was absolutely here for it, man, when they actually officially announced it, because there were so many rumors going back and forth. We heard so much about Demidov potentially signing as soon as this month, but then so many reports about him potentially being sent down to the VHL after SK St. Petersburg got eliminated. There were just so many conflicting reports. So to actually see the Canadiens officially announce it was almost a miracle. It definitely felt like a dream, but definitely did not feel real, especially with how much, and I tweeted about this afterwards, we saw so much controversy about Malyficent's contract, Ivan Demidov staying in the KHL, what that would look like for the future. The fact that we have both of these studs in the NHL before they're 20, the Russian factor is dead. I don't want to hear any of you guys saying, oh, he has a KHL contract until he's 20 years old. They'll find a way if they really want him in the NHL. It's happened with Michkov. It's happened with Ivan Demidov. I mean, there was a situation where I thought he would have had to wait until next season to actually get signed. Here he is, and he could potentially be making his debut in the NHL regular season, potentially the playoffs. We'll have to wait and see. But the thing is, with all of this hype around Ivan Demidov, we're starting to hear a little bit more about how the 2024 NHL Draft went down. Of course, the Montreal Canadiens getting to select him at 5th overall is looking like an absolute steal, but there was a lot that was going on with trade talks around Montreal and that 5th overall pick, and things could have gone a lot differently. Recently, we had Elliotte Friedman on the 32 Thoughts podcast giving us a lot more info on the 2024 draft and the process behind it for Montreal, and how for Montreal as well, there could have been a massive trade that would have shaken things up in a major way. As Elliotte Friedman wrote in 32 Thoughts column, following the news that the Canadiens signed Ivan Demidov, it surfaced that there were two aborted trades at last year's draft that could have changed history. And we actually get the full details here, saying that the Chicago Blackhawks offered to trade their 2026 first rounder, an unprotected pick by the way, for the 4th pick selection, which the Columbus Blue Jackets ultimately turned down. Second, the Canadiens attempted to acquire Trevor Zegras in a trade that never materialized. Freeman writes, I suspect it's because the Canadiens changed their minds when they realized Demidov would fall to 5, although they were not offering that particular pick in the Zegras deal. Now, there's a lot to go through here, not just with Montreal, but Chicago, Columbus, basically every team in that top 5 had their hands in something. But there was a lot to sink our teeth into just with that, and we have more coming in the trade rumor aspect with Freeman as well. He'll talk about it more in a bit here. But what's interesting is that we have this long rumor Montreal Zegras connection that almost became a reality in the 2024 draft. Now, as Freeman mentions, it's not for that 5th overall pick, which I saw some people being confused about. It's not for that selection, which I think would have been a massive mistake for the Habs, but likely would have been more like a first round pick potentially plus something extra. But it seemed like for Montreal, because they were going after Demidov, they knew they could get him, that maybe swayed them away from the Zegras contention, which I find interesting. I think for Demidov, yes, he is more likely to be a winger long-term personally, same thing with Zegras as well, so maybe that was something that counteracted each other, but I think for Montreal, their focus was getting on Demidov, and at 5th overall, I mean, he fell to their laps. But I do want to talk about the Chicago and Columbus trade for a second, because that is fascinating. I mean, if Chicago traded their 2026 unprotected first, which right now is projected to go 2nd overall, that could have been completely out of the blue. I mean, I think for Chicago, if they were able to make that trade happen, Ivan Demidov is not a Montreal Canadian. I guarantee Chicago would have taken an Ivan Demidov in that selection, which meant they could have gone and gotten Artem Levchinov at 2nd and an Ivan Demidov at 4th overall, which I think makes the Levchinov situation and his selection at 2nd overall a lot more palatable. It's pretty crazy to me that Chicago would even offer their unprotected first round pick at all in a trade, but I think that's how highly valued a player like Demidov was, even though he ended up going back down to 5th overall. This was still somebody that had so much potential, and you could see it, and I'm sure for Chicago, it was between Levchinov or Demidov. Even though they went for Levchinov in the end, I'm sure they wanted to take Demidov as well, have those two guys together. That would have been sensational. But of course, that trade didn't end up going down, and the Columbus Blue Jackets ended up keeping that pick and selecting Kane Lindstrom. there is still a lot of time here left to see how this actually does pan out. In Lindstrom's case, of course, the injury to his back has been severely brutal this year, keeping him out of action for the entire season and potentially for the rest of it as well in the playoffs. He will be going to MSU next year, which I think is going to be very interesting, but I think his progression is definitely going to be stunted. You compare that to a potential top 2 pick this year where you could be getting a Michael Misa or a Matthew Schaefer, and personally for me, I'm definitely more on that train of the 2026 draft looking back on it, but of course, revisionist history, and it would have changed things up quite a bit. I think for Chicago, they would have been able to land a Demidov 100%. They would have taken him, even though they maybe could have gone for a bigger forward like Lindstrom. I think going for the bigger defenseman like Levshunov gave them an opportunity to go after a smaller forward, which is what we saw a little bit as well the rest of the draft. But for Columbus, man, just imagining the potential of them having a Misa or a Schaefer in their system, that would be insane. Now, I wanted to mention this because I thought this was a very interesting situation that Elliotte Friedman expanded upon later in the 32 Thoughts podcast, and NHL Watcher gives us the summarization here, saying that Friedman on 32 Thoughts podcast says he believes Montreal was working on a trade for Trevor Zegras in the last draft, which we now know. They were offering a young defenseman and a first-round pick. Not 5, but the pick they selected Michael Hage with at 21st overall. So what the trade could have potentially been was Montreal sending a young defenseman and that 21st overall pick to the Anaheim Ducks on top of that 5th overall pick. But it seems like because of Demidov being selected, they went in a different direction, which I can understand. Now, what's interesting about this is that this connects to a long rumor as well that there was a potential Logan Mailloux for Trevor Zegras trade, and I think that's what it would have been. It would have been Mailloux and that 21st overall pick for Trevor Zegras, which I think in terms of value does line up pretty well, especially for Zegras at the time, of course, with the inconsistent injuries and still up to this point dealing with those this season. But I think in terms of a trade value proposal, that does make sense. But this does lead me to believe that if Montreal were in a different position, maybe even if they were to have a Lindstrom available, if Demidov was taken at 4th overall, they might have gone for a defenseman. They might have gone for a Z Buum or a Sam Dickinson. I don't know who exactly it would have been, but they could have gone in a different direction and actually gone for a defenseman. If they were trading a player like Logan Mailloux, I think that represents a hole they're opening up in that defensive pool to bring in somebody with that 5th overall pick. And especially if Mailloux were to go, that would leave a big offensive hole on the defense, and of course a 21st overall pick. But I will say, even though I'm not the biggest fan of Mailloux's game, especially defensively, I think the Habs did make the right choice. I'm a huge fan of Michael Hage, so that represents a lot of the reasoning behind that. But at 21st overall, I think he is a sensational player to get at that range, and the fact that both Hage dropped at 21st overall and Demidov dropped at 5th overall, I think the way the Habs played it out made sense, and I think looking back on it was exactly what they needed to do. When we look at what the 2024 draft could have been, where a team like Chicago rises to 4th overall and selects Ivan Demidov, the Habs trade their 21st overall pick and Mailloux for Trevor Zegras, it could have been a situation where they would have gone for a defenseman like a Sam Dickinson and Zegras compared to Demidov and Hage. And that is an interesting proposition and a comparison there. I do like the defensemen that were available. I mean, if it would have been a Z Buum, that to me would have been the best defenseman of the draft. That would have been insane, having Buum and Lane Hutson as your top 2 lefty. Ridiculous numbers would have come out of those two. But I think in terms of the Habs' needs for what they truly needed going forward, and also how good Lane Hutson has also proved to be, I think the Habs made the right decision here. They needed, I think, a top-end, pure skill forward that can do everything that Demidov does on a consistent level, and also, I think, a potential middle six center of the future. Hage, I think, will be that, and I think even has the potential, in a certain point as well, to be a second-line center, which, especially at this point, is something that Montreal is really lacking for the future as well. You look at a lot of contending teams and how good they built themselves up, a lot of the great moves that they make are the ones that they don't make, and I think for Montreal, they've had a lot of offers on the table, a lot of players they could have gone for, guys that like Pierre-Luc Dubois that have been rumored in the past, guys like, of course, like Trevor Zegras, who they could have gotten, who are solid players in their own right and have their own great attributes. But I think for Montreal, they've picked the right players along this path. Having a player like Demidov is a transformative piece, and even though a lot of that was because of luck, hey, you make the right pick at the right time, and that's all you really need to do. And in Ivan Demidov's case, he's exactly what the doctor ordered for this Habs team. Granted, I still think that Trevor Zegras is a solid player, and especially in Montreal would have been a ton of fun. I mean, having him and Cole Caulfield on the same team back again would have been awesome. And I think he's been underrated again this year with Anaheim. In the games he's played, especially recently, he's been pretty fantastic. I think in his last 20 games, he's hovering around a point per game, so that's really great to see. He's starting to find his footing again, which I'm really happy about after how many injuries and inconsistencies he's dealt with recently. But he's a solid player. I just don't think he's up to the level of a Demidov or a player like Hage combined. I think those two players just bring so much value for the Habs long term, and even those years would have been fun, I don't know if he's exactly what this Habs team needed. And you also look at the position that Zegras would have needed to play, that center position for Montreal, and I just don't think it would have worked out. It's not really working out for Anaheim either. I mean, this year is a 36% face-off percentage. I just don't think that's very sustainable long-term. So if Montreal was looking at Zegras to be their second-line center of the future, to be that type of guy, I don't think he would have been able to reach that type of level. But I love stories like this because it gives us such an idea of what happened behind the scenes here, especially at last year's draft and how chaotic it was. I mean, as NHL Watcher points out and Elliotte Friedman points out, it was so interesting when the Seneca move happened. It seemed like it really changed the trajectory of the draft. I mean, there was a lot of speculation about Lefebvre going to Chicago at second overall, and that wasn't a massive surprise at the time. But really, Seneca and that selection was the big one. And as Elliotte Friedman says, what changed was when Anaheim selected Seneca. Montreal knew they would have a shot at Demidov, and Hughes and Gordon are very careful about redundancy. That to me is just so interesting because I think it changed both Chicago and Montreal's game plans. Because I don't know if Chicago would have been so hell-bent on trading for that 4th overall pick if a player like Demidov wasn't available. I mean, guys like Lindstrom, they would have been fine in Chicago Blackhawks, but I don't think you're trading a unprotected first-round pick in 2026 for a player that isn't up to the standard of Demidov, up to the talent level that Demidov provides. So not only was Montreal surprised and really interested at that point, sticking with that 5th overall pick, but Chicago also almost made a generational leap and was able to get a player like Demidov as well, which would have been unbelievable. But that's just what's so interesting is that we saw an unprotected first-round pick from a team like Chicago being thrown around. We saw so much chatter around Montreal that almost happened, and then Montreal ended up nixing it in the end. So much almost happened with the 2024 draft, and even without these trades, it was still such a chaotic first round, and all the better for it, really. But you look back at that unprotected first round pick, and honestly, I would trade any pick in this year's draft for Ivan Demidov. I love Michael Misa. Matthew Schaefer brings so much potential, but I don't think anybody in this draft has the talent, the pure skill, the pure confidence and potential that Ivan Demidov brings. But it would have been a fascinating change. I mean, that first round pick could be a 1st overall pick in this year's draft. So it is going to be interesting going forward whether missing on Ivan Demidov is going to be this big stain for Chicago, or whether they'll get a player like Misa who could really fit in a big role. We'll have to wait and see there. But I just love how many changing parts there were that could have been so different here. But I really think the big winner out of all this is Montreal, the moves that didn't end up happening. For the Habs, it was a great thing that we saw so little activity because that allowed Montreal to come in really uncontested and get Ivan Demidov at number 5. And I think for Chicago, they saw how scary that possibility was. That's why they wanted to trade for 4th overall. That's why we haven't heard anything about them trying to trade for 5th overall because let's be honest, I think every team out there knew they wanted Demidov in the end. Now, at the time of the draft, it wasn't the most surprising thing to see a player like Demidov fall to 5th overall. I mean, we saw Matvei Michkov fall to number 7 the year before, so there was always this weird Russian factor around these prospects, which really shouldn't have been there in the first place, in my opinion. But now we have so much more background. Now we have so much more context as to the reasons why the Demidov actually fell to 5th overall, why it actually happened in the first place. It really shouldn't have happened, but now we know that there was so much more interest in trying to trade to get Demidov before Montreal even had the chance to select him. How much the Seneca pick as well. It was pretty obvious how much it changed the draft at the time, but now we know even more. It really changed the game plan of everybody and really presented a lot of new opportunities for teams. And for Montreal as well, I think they're the biggest winners out of all of this. Again, it's the trades they didn't make. It's the moves that they didn't end up completing that might end up being big wins for them. Michael Hage is going to be fantastic, but of course, Ivan Demidov 5th overall is looking like a steal. It was a steal on day 1 in the first second of selecting him, but now it's even more obvious as to why. I gotta say as well, big thank you to Elliotte Friedman for spilling these beans. I always love hearing stuff like this, and we don't hear enough of it. I want to hear so much more about what happens behind the scenes of the draft, because there is obviously so much that we don't get to hear about until years later. But all I'm saying is that I am so freaking excited for the debut of Ivan Demidov. He is a special player, and it's gonna be a transcendent one for Montreal. I mean, he's at a point, too, of his skill that I'm not even that bad. I don't really feel that bad with putting the expectations that I put on him. He's going to be that guy. He's going to be unbelievable as long as he just continues to play his game. He is at that elite caliber of prospect and has been for a long time now. But man, I just need to make his debut already because I will be seated there every single second with my popcorn on day 1. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more Trading Room content just like this. And if you want to see more, make sure you, of course, hit that notification bell so you don't get notified on all the other videos that I upload here in the future. Of course, comment down below all your thoughts on these rejected trades by Montreal, all these rejected trades around the NHL at the 2024 draft and how that could have changed things. Who do you think came out the big winners from it? Do you think Montreal was the big winner? Chicago, Columbus? Let me know all your thoughts down below. Of course, make sure you share it with all the hockey fans you guys know online. Get the stories of the 2024 draft out there. And click on this card as well for all of my hockey prospects talk right in one playlist. Also, a big thank you to Extra for sponsoring today's video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.